kind of like to start, if you would give us just your name and the branch of service you served in and what time period you were in the military.
Okay. My name is Leslie E. Mokry. I was joined the military in enlisted on 4/16/42 in the Naval Air Corps. Went through the Navy flight program and was commissioned on the 9th of June 1943 as an ensign USNR. Went through flight training at Olathe, Kansas, and Corpus Christi, Texas. After graduation from Corpus Christi, we were sent to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, to learn how to fly the torpedo bomber. My claim to fame is that I was assigned to the same flight with George Herbert Walker Bush.
Oh my goodness.
There were 8 student pilots and 2 instructors assigned to each flight down there. This training lasted approximately 8 weeks. From there, we went to Glenview, Illinois, where they had a couple of converted they were converted from passenger boats to laptops. A lot of people don't know that. There was the USS Wolverine and the USS Sable. All they had was they stripped off the superstructure and put a flight deck on them.
Oh my. Wow.
And we flew out from Glenview, made 8 carrier landings, and then we were considered naval aviators.
Oh my.
From there, we went back to Norfolk, sent to Naval Air Station, Norfolk, Virginia, and were assigned to various units. I was assigned to a squadron called VC-1, which was a submarine anti-killer squadron, anti-submarine, anti-killer, hunter-killer squadron. We went out on a couple of cruises, one on the USS Block Island and one on the USS Bogue. These cruises lasted approximately 8 weeks each. After the second cruise, got back and VC-1 was decommissioned, and I was put in, or assigned to, I should say, Fighter Squadron 74. We flew the F-6F type Hellcat. We were being trained for a special mission and no one knew what it was. We eventually found out. Originally we were going in on D-Day, on Normandy, but that was changed. And we went in August of '44 and helped cover the invasion of southern France. By that time the German Air Force had been reduced to practically nothing, but the anti-aircraft ack was very thick. We lost 5 pilots over there. After that was over, we came back to Quonset Point, Rhode Island, Naval Air Station, and I was assigned to Night Torpedo Squadron 91. We trained there at Quonset Point for several weeks. We eventually went to the West Coast and then on to Hawaii, where we trained some more. And in March or April of '45, we went aboard the USS Bonhomme Richard and went out and joined Task Force 38 or 58, depending on who was the commander. We were right off the coast of Japan, made several sorties over the Japanese islands, and we lost 2 crews over there. Incidentally, the torpedo bomber carried a crew of 3, a pilot, a turret gunner, and a radioman who was down in the so-called belly of the aircraft. Oh, and to say we lost 2 crews over there. One night, a couple of boys went after an aircraft carrier and never did come back. We were right off the coast of Japan when the war ended. As you all probably know, we were getting ready to invade. And fortunately, they dropped the atomic bombs and the war was over. We participated in the World War II flyover over the Missouri as they were signing the peace treaty. And when they then converted the carrier to the so-called red carpet. All of our planes were parked on the flight deck, and the hangar deck was converted to a bunk room. We had bunks, I think they were about 6 high. And then we came back to the States. From there I got a 30-day leave, came home, went up to Glenview Naval Air Station and taught cadets cross-country flying. On June the 30th of 46, I was released in active duty and went back to attend Otterbein College. I had 3 years in before the war. I immediately went to Naval Air Station Columbus, Ohio, and joined an active reserve. From there I was recalled during the Korean fracas, so-called police action. But actually they were just killed the boys just as dead during Korea as they did any other time. I didn't have to go overseas. I was assigned to a squadron at Quonset Point, Rhode Island as an administrative officer. After I was released again to inactive duty in 44, I returned to Middletown and stayed in reserve until my retirement from the Navy in 1981.
I'd like to, if I can, ask you a few questions about some of the things you
Go ahead.
discussed. Can you explain what the torpedo bombers did and different than, say, the B-29 bomber? What
Okay.
was the difference?
Well, the torpedo bomber was the largest single-engine aircraft in World War II. And I say it carried a crew of 3. It carried one 2,000-pound torpedo, 4 500-pound bombs, 10 200-pound bombs, and it replaced the TBD, which I'm sure everybody's heard of Torpedo Squadron 8. There was only one survivor, Ensign George Gay, but it replaced this old low and slow aircraft. It made an approach on a torpedo run at approximately 150 knots at 150 feet above the water.
So are these the planes you refer to as the sub-killers? Is that
Yes,
what your
ma'am.
primary function was?
Yes,
was
ma'am. Well, torpedoing surface craft and
to
submarines. Yes, ma'am.
When you flew out, did you have fighters with you to help make sure?
We were in the VC squadron. We flew as a team. We flew the torpedo bomber, and there was an F-4F Wildcat.
Okay.
At that time, we flew as a team, as I said, and we carried a so-called smart bomb, which nobody, they wouldn't even let us see it. When they loaded them on our airplanes, they put a curtain around the aircraft. All we knew was that if we dropped the thing, it would head toward the sound of the submarine,
Wow.
submarine's engines.
Now on your plane, you said there were 3 crews: the pilot, the gunner, and the radio man. Whose responsibility was it to release your bombs?
The pilot. The pilot was mainly responsible for everything. We did dead reckoning navigation. We had radio silence unless we made a contact.
Now, when you say dead reckoning, do you mean by stars or?
No.
For those of us who have no idea what
Seriously?
I mean,
Okay.
I know IFR in this.
Yeah, well, dead reckoning was you sat down with a so-called plotting board, and you plotted the course of the ship and where you were the sector that you were supposed to fly in, And this was all done ahead of time.
Okay.
One hairy incident we had, one day the ceiling was real low and then it lifted a little bit, so they shot us off for a mission. And when the fighter and I got back to where the aircraft carrier was supposed to be, it wasn't there. So it's a lonely feeling, believe me. We flew what we call an expanding square, where you fly 2 times the visibility, then 4 times the visibility, then 6 times. But on the visibility, you know, on the second or third leg, I don't remember which, we spotted the ship. And the fighter that was with me made a straight-in approach. He didn't even go up around like normal. And as he was taxiing out of the arresting gear, he ran out of gas. And as I made my approach and made my landing, the ship pitched and I almost went over the side. But be that as it may, I didn't. Another interesting thing, I think, what happened when we were on the Block Island. One night we were surrounded by 5 submarines. We had 5 submarine contacts, and why they had never sunk us, I'll never know. We were all up on the flight deck with our life jackets on and so forth, ready to abandon ship, but they never fired on us.
Now, were these Japanese subs or German?
German.
Okay.
This was in the Atlantic.
Atlantic,
Yeah.
okay.
I served in the Atlantic, in the Mediterranean, and the Pacific, so I feel sort of lucky to be here.
That's a lot of, yeah, a lot of ground
Seen
there.
a lot of action.
From some other veterans I've talked to, I know there's a big difference between landing your plane on a ship and landing it on ground. Was there times during your service that you were called to land at night?
Oh yes, I was in this night
Can you tell
torpedoes.
us about that?
Well,
Obviously, that's got to be pretty tough thing.
every landing at night was an experience, quite frankly. All you could see was the flight deck lit up on each side, and the landing signal officer had a fluorescent stripes on his suit. He would give the signals, and your life was in his hands. You just come in and follow the signals that he gave you, and if you got a cut, or so-called to land, it was mandatory, or if you got a wave off, it was a mandatory signal. But everything was quite an experience. It was an experience that I wouldn't take anything for, but I wouldn't want my son or any other young people to have to go through the same thing.
So do you have any juicy gossip on Mr. Bush? How was he to serve
Well,
with?
Not anything juicy. He was a pretty regular guy.
Was he?
Uh,
Now, he flew in a crew with you, or?
no, he flew in the same flight. Now, this wasn't in combat. This
Right.
was just in training.
Right.
We flew out of Fort Lauderdale, and we often flew over the Bermuda Triangle.
Did you see anything?
Didn't see a thing. But we went out there and practiced dropping bombs and torpedoes and strafing. And I'm sure you've heard of the lost flight from Fort Lauderdale in 1945. We flew that hop many times. I just checked my logbook the other day. It's a standardized flight from Fort Lauderdale out, make a cross leg, and then back to the station. And nobody ever knows what happened to those fellas. What else can I tell you?
Well, let's see. How old were you when you went into the service?
20.
Okay, so you didn't yet have a wife and kids back home.
No. And I didn't get married while I was in service. I waited till I got back.
Did you? So, were you drafted or did you enlist?
I enlisted. I got a draft notice and I went down and enlisted in the Naval Air Corps.
Found that quite a few people from this area, which surprises me with the Air Force Base being here, were in the Navy.
Mm-hmm.
Probably a great majority of our veterans have been Navy.
Well, it's good service. Good service.
What was the Torpedo Squadron, those bombers, the only planes you flew at that time, or did you go to different squadrons, fly different planes?
No, I flew the torpedo bomber and the F-6, which was known as the Avenger,
Uh-huh.
and the F-6F, which was known as the Hellcat.
Did your same group that you trained with, squadrons, stay together
No,
through?
they broke us up pretty much. And it was interesting, when we first went to a squadron, we liked to fly together with the guys that we flew with, and the same crewmen, but they wouldn't do it. They put an experienced crewman with a so-called inexperienced pilot,
Mm-hmm.
which made sense, really.
Yeah.
On the ships that you were on flying off of, how many airplanes did they carry? I mean, how many would be on?
Okay, well, the cruises in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean were on the so-called jeep carriers, the small aircraft carriers. We had, as I recall, I think 18 torpedo bombers and 27 F-4F Wildcats. That was when we were in BC-1. In the fighter squadron, when we went over to southern France, we had some, I believe, 30 aircraft, 30 F-6Fs aboard.
That's a bunch.
On the
Yeah.
big
That was the small
aircraft.
ship?
That's a small one. Well, they were only 500 and some feet long. The Bonhomme Richard, which is a ship I flew off of in the Pacific, was an Essex class carrier, and it's 987, 85, somewhere along there feet long.
Wow.
And we just had a fighter squadron, torpedo squadron aboard there. And I'm just trying to think. There were more fighters than there were torpedo bombers. I'm going to say there were probably 50 fighters and maybe 30 torpedo bombers. I'll show you a picture pretty soon.
Okay. Now, you said toward the end of your service you were doing the flyover of the USS Missouri. Can
Yes,
you
ma'am.
elaborate on that a little bit? Was it a pretty good feeling after all that struggle?
Oh, yes. It was a great feeling to see those guys down there signing that peace treaty. But every carrier that was out there, every squadron was out there, flew over. It was a grand and glorious flyover. Of course, we couldn't see what was going on, but we knew what was going on.
I mean, you didn't get low enough to blow the papers.
No, they wouldn't let us do it, unfortunately.
But you really wanted to, didn't you? I can tell.
Well, that's what a torpedo bomber did. We flew low and fast.
Now, were you ever in Japan itself after the war?
I went ashore a couple of times, and it was devastating, believe me.
What part did you?
Went in Tokyo, into
Tokyo.
Tokyo, yes. Went by the Emperor's Palace. Of course, it was unscathed. That was a no, you couldn't bomb that. But it's a country that I wouldn't want to live in.
Wouldn't you?
Mhm.
How come?
Well, it was just it looked like everything was, you're either rich or poor, actually. No middle class.
Now,
But
through.
saw the people, they were living in shacks and pieces of tin, plywood, whatever they could gather up to make a home. It was sad, but those are the things that happened in the war.
Now, you were also serving during Korea.
Korea.
And what were were you training pilots at the time, or you said that
Well,
was at Rhode Island?
Well, I was just assigned as a personnel officer of a squadron which sent teams of pilots. They were flying the AD, what they call it, I'll think of it in a minute. But we sent teams of 6 to 8 men and 4 airplanes that flew at night. They had a big radar on them, and so they sent them in. We had 125 men and 125 officers and 500 enlisted men in that squadron.
And they all flew off aircraft carriers too?
Yes.
Okay. And now they were flying missions over Korea?
Over Korea, yeah.
Okay. And you weren't in Korea?
No, I did
The
not
States.
have to go overseas.
Okay. Reflecting, you made a career out of the service, so to speak. I mean,
Well, just
staying in
reserve
reserves.
part, yeah.
Did-
I had to go every weekend, or one weekend a month,
Mhm.
2 weeks a year, and all during that time I missed one weekend because I'd hurt my back and the doctor wouldn't let me drive.
Looking back over your military career, some of the friends that you made in the service, have you kept in contact with them through the years?
Yes, an interesting thing, my gunner was only 16 years old. I didn't know that at the time. I never found it out till 1987 at a squadron reunion. But he had sort of
Snuck in.
fibbed about his age and...
A whole bunch.
Yeah.
Your life was in his hands. He must have been a mature young man.
Was he a country boy that
He was a southern boy.
Was he? Looking back through all of your experiences through World War II and Korea and so forth, is there positive things that came out of your military experience?
I think so.
What would they be?
Learned to get along well with people, and I saw people from all walks of life. On our drill weekends, you met executives down to ditch diggers, and I mean, there's nothing wrong with being a ditch digger. Don't get me wrong, but that's just the chasm from here to there. I always enjoyed all my reserve career, and if somebody's in the service now, I'd recommend they stay in reserve after they get out.
Do you? Looking back, if you had to say anything negative from your experiences, what stands out to you? What would be the negatives?
Being away from home. Sort of a homeboy, but that was one thing. Being just a lad from Middletown, Ohio, why it's sort of like a country boy that went to the big city. There were good times, there were bad times. Flying at night back then was really hazardous.
Well, you didn't have the radar and technology we have today. It
Oh,
was
no.
wing and a prayer.
Wing and a prayer. We had some radar, but it wasn't anywhere near as sophisticated as what they have today. And again, we had to go dead reckoning. We weren't allowed to. We were in radio silence.
Well, to end up here, if you had a message to say to people, especially youth 50 years from now that might view this, to sum up your experience, anything that you'd like to say to them, what would you like to leave as your final comments?
Let's say, try to settle any disagreements at the peace table instead of war, on the battlefield, so to speak.
It's Marjorie Zimmerman, and I wasn't married.
Right. Okay. So, Marjorie,
Hey,
you were in the
You ain't got
women's
that thing on.
I was in the Army Nurse Corps.
Army Nurse School.
And what's that thing for?
It's a microphone.
Oh, I don't put it on me.
No,
No.
it's fine. Just sitting there is fine.
I graduated from St. Elizabeth Hospital, and I really was